In this video, we're going to take a look at an important question that I often have heard over the years. It goes like this: can you preach it at the gates of Auschwitz? The idea being here that we test the adequacy, the livability, the acceptability of particular theologies of providence, by implication, often particular theodicies as well, by asking this question: can you preach them at the gates of Auschwitz? Now, as you can probably suspect, the gates of Auschwitz here is a metaphor for any moment of extreme suffering, injustice, evil in the world. The question being, in those moments where that terrible evil occurs, where something that is a stain on the moral fabric of existence, that there is a rift of nihilism, of evil and suffering within human existence or the universe, in those moments, can you preach your theology at the gates of those moral horrors, of those moments of terrible suffering? Here's an example of this position, this point, the question being raised. In this case, it's by Roger Olson, and he raises it against Calvinism. So Olson is an Arminian, and in his book Against Calvinism, he says, someone has said that no theology is worth believing that cannot be preached standing in front of the gates of Auschwitz. I, for one, could not stand at those gates and preach a version of God's sovereignty that makes the extermination of 6 million Jews, including many children, a part of the will and plan of God, such that God foreordained and rendered it certain. So Olson says one significant objection to Calvinism is that you can't preach it at the gates of Auschwitz. It's just unacceptable to consider this theology of providence in light of these terrible moments of suffering. Here's the thing, however, that the same objection which Olson raises against Calvinism can be raised against Arminian theologies. Arminian theologies don't take the Calvinist view that God determines all events, but nonetheless, Arminian theologies classically do take the view that God foreknows all events will occur and God allows those events to occur for some morally sufficient reason. So here's the way that Greg Boyd puts it. Now, Greg Boyd posted this as a tweet about 5 years ago, just after a terrible school shooting occurred in the United States. And he tweets this little meme from the God's Not Dead 2 movie, which says, my life may not be going the way I planned it, but it is going exactly the way God planned it. Now that meme is consistent with Calvinism, but it's also consistent with an Arminian theology that God simply foreknows and therefore allows for some supreme providential purpose all the terrible things that happen. And so Boyd's quip by way of response is, yeah, tell that to those who lost loved ones in yesterday's massacre. In other words, Boyd is saying you can't preach either theology of meticulous providence, whether it be the Calvinist or the Arminian one, at the gates of Auschwitz. You can't preach it standing by blood-stained sidewalks, to put it another way. Okay, but here's the thing now. The same point objection that you raised to the Calvinist and to the Arminian, you can also raise to Greg Boyd and his openness theology. You see, on Greg Boyd's theology, it is true that God didn't foreknow from eternity that this individual would freely choose to shoot these people in the school shooting. But nonetheless, moments before, hours before it happened, God knew the inner processes of this person's mind. God knew what that person was going to do. When that person fired the trigger of their gun and the bullets were flying through the air, God could have just tipped one of those bullets after another so that none of them would ever hit their target. And so, in fact, the guy's free will would never have been impinged upon at all. But God nonetheless could have spared all the lives that were lost that day. And yet, on Boyd's theology, God didn't do that. On Boyd's theology, God certainly knew that the Nazis, when they began using the Einsatzgruppen in the late 1930s, which were these mobile units to kill Jews, that they were moving toward ultimately the final solution. He could anticipate that. And certainly when Auschwitz was built, God knew it was there and God never did anything to stop it. So can you preach that theology at the gates of Auschwitz? That, well, God didn't foreknow it perhaps, but once it was happening, God knew it and he did nothing. He didn't stop it. So Boyd's theology, is it any more preachable at the gates of Auschwitz or standing on the bloodstained concrete outside a high school? I don't see how it is. That's the problem with using this as a criterion. to judge theodicies and judge theologies of providence based upon whether they are palatable in the moments of greatest suffering. I have a twofold response here then. My first response is, I don't think that when we are suffering terribly, when we are, as it were, standing at the gates of Auschwitz, that is really the time for any theology. For the most part, that's the time for comfort. That's the time for sitting on one's mourning bench, one's bench of mourning, of crying, of grieving, and just enduring the dark night of the soul with them, rather than engaging in some theological treatise as to why God determined this would happen, or why he foreknew it would happen, or why he allowed it to happen on an openness view. It isn't the time for that theology. It doesn't mean that the theology is flawed just because you don't pull it out when people are in the midst of egregious suffering. And there is probably not a better example of this than C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis wrote arguably the preeminent, certainly one of the preeminent theodicies at a popular level of the 20th century. It's called The Problem of Pain. And in The Problem of Pain, Lewis surveys a range of I think, very persuasive, intriguing responses to the problem of evil. But when Lewis's own wife, Joy, was diagnosed with cancer, Lewis did not go back and read The Problem of Pain, because his problem wasn't one of theodicy. His problem wasn't one of developing an adequate theology of providence, and he certainly didn't judge his theodicy based upon the fact that he couldn't preach it in the moment that he was suffering at Joy's bedside while she was dying of cancer. Instead, what he did was he wrote another book, A Grief Observed. And this is one little bit from A Grief Observed. He says, people get over these things. Come, I shan't do so badly. One is ashamed to listen to this voice, but it seems for a little to be making out a good case. Then comes a sudden jab of red-hot memory, and all the common sense vanishes like an ant in the mouth of a furnace. See, the point is that the theology may be perfectly fine, but the point, nonetheless, is that when you're suffering, that theology can be burned up like an ant in the mouth of a furnace. And so you don't pull it out when people are suffering. You don't, when they're suffering, when you're standing at the gates of Auschwitz, you don't judge any theology on its ability to offer people pastoral comfort in those moments. You judge theology apart. You judge the theology of providence with some emotional distance from those bracing, all-encompassing, debilitating moments of suffering. But when you suffer, like Lewis talks about in The Grief Observed, that's when you simply have to journey with people in their suffering. It's a different kind of response, a pastoral response that is required rather than a theological response. But to sum up then, whether it be Calvinism, Arminianism, openness theology, or any other theology of providence, you don't judge it by asking the question, can you preach it at the gates of Auschwitz? Because you really shouldn't be preaching at the gates of Auschwitz to begin with. What you should be doing is breaking them down to fight against the injustice of them and offering comfort to those who have been afflicted in the midst of that suffering.